And so I'd like to introduce our wonderful guest, Jan Minor Holden. She has many accolades. It's a wonderful pleasure. She's a speaker. And amongst them, she has a doctorate in education. She's a licensed professional counselor, the faculty in the counseling program at the University of North Texas. Since 2008, she's been the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Near-Death Studies. And her dissertation has actually been on how to counsel people with NDEs and related experiences. And not least of which, she is the current president of IANDS and doing an absolute superb job. So it's with great pleasure that we welcome you here this afternoon, Jan, to talk about after-death communication, including your research and that of others.
Yeah, thank you so much, Angie. It's my pleasure to be here. And this is one of my favorite topics. Near-death experiences and after-death communication are the things I love talking about the most. And I think after-death communication, maybe even a tiny bit more, because it's more accessible to more people than near-death experiences are, and for people to experience directly. So as you'll hear, I'll be talking about that later on, about how to actually facilitate having this experience. So as Angie mentioned, I retired in 2019 from the University of North Texas Counseling Program faculty. I'd been on that faculty for 31 years. And during that whole time, I was researching NDEs and ADC and other transpersonal experiences, but mostly those two things. And so I guess without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and show you a PowerPoint as I talk. And this, you're going to see on this screen that I have Noel listed as a co-author, and that's because originally I did most of this presentation, but when we did a presentation together about a year ago about ADC in the age of COVID, she provided what you're going to see about the media coverage of ADC. And so I still want to credit her with helping to prepare what you're about to see. So let's see if I can get there we go. So I'm going to start with a definition of ADC and then summarize research on spontaneous ADC that is not ADC that was attempted to be facilitated, but that occurred to people, maybe invited, but still occurred very spontaneously. And then talk about some recent examples of ADC coverage in the media and recommended responses and resources for if you want to learn more about the subject. So beginning with the definition, after-death communication is a phenomenon in which a living person has a feeling or sense of direct contact with a physically deceased person or animal. And this definition came from my former doctoral student, now Dr. Jenny Streithorn, who you're going to hear about in a minute more, because she did her dissertation on after-death communication. And a lot of what I am presenting to you comes from her research. And most often these experiences are spontaneous. They occur to, even if a person would like it, they usually can't just like make it happen this instant. And often it happens without the person inviting or anticipating it at all. In all those cases, it's essentially spontaneous. It happens when it wants to happen, sort of thing. And but it's also possible to facilitate near-death or after-death communication. And the technique that is used for that is technically titled induced after-death communication. But even the person who developed that, we'll be talking about him a little later, said that we really don't induce after-death communication. What we induce, if anything, is a state of mind in which ADC can more readily occur. So I prefer the term facilitated, that we often can, but not always, but often can facilitate ADC with clients in using a particular approach in grief counseling. So I'm going to summarize what we know from research, and we know a lot. Jenny did her dissertation, published her dissertation in 2011. And I remember when she was sitting in my office, we were talking about what she was going to do for her dissertation. We were actually going to do a study that I ended up doing many years later that you'll be hearing about later. But in the process of doing any study, one has to do what's called a literature review. And you go into the professional literature and find all the relevant publications and what those authors found and what that points to as what's needed for further research. And then that is what you offer as your justification for doing your own dissertation study. So she's sitting there in my office. We're starting to put this idea together. And I said to her, I'll bet you that literature review isn't going to take you but a couple of weeks, because there can't be but a half dozen articles out there. She came back 2 weeks later and she said, would you believe that starting in the late 1800s through the time that she was beginning her dissertation research, there had been 35 studies published involving over 50,000 people from 24 countries. And we're like, oh my goodness. So just trying to figure out from all those studies some basic facts about ADC was really difficult, because the studies ranged widely in the type of participants they had, the number of participants they had, the kinds of questions they asked. And so somebody might, one study might say that that the incidence of ADC, meaning the number of people who experience ADC after the incident of the death of a loved one, is like 20%, and another researcher would find 80%, and we'd find everywhere in between. And it's like, how do we even make sense of all this? So she changed her focus and did what's called a systematic review of all that research. And she developed a way to rank the studies from the methodologically strongest. And so we can trust those results the most, down to the methodologically weakest. And from there, we were able to see that when you look at just the methodologically strongest studies, there's a much narrower range of like incidence for ADC. And she was able to come to what research really indicates is the incidence of this phenomenon, which you'll be hearing about in a minute. Interestingly, at the same time that Jenny was doing her study, I was invited to serve on the examination committee for a woman in Australia who did a qualitative study of 21 adult after-death communication experiencers. And she did, unlike Jenny, who was looking at all these articles and trying to figure out how their statistics could make any sense, Michelle was doing in-depth interviews with ADCers and finding out the process of their experience and how it affected them and that sort of thing. So these two studies really complement each other. So you'll be hearing me refer to both of them, because I would say that when you put their studies together, there's about 80% overlap of the same information, and they don't contradict each other at all. But what they agree on constitutes about an 80% overlap. And then some things Jenny's study touched on that Michelle's didn't, and some Michelle's touched on that Jenny's didn't. So I've put those all together in this presentation. And I should say too that most recently in 2020, Evelyn Elsacer in Europe, she led a research team. They did an intensive study of after-death communication in, I think it was 3 European countries, and they had several hundred people participate in the study, and her results are published online, and I'll give you the link to that at the end of the presentation. So hers is another great source for detailed, a very well-designed study with detailed information. And so we begin with the types of ADC. Probably most often, the experiencer has a very distinct sense of the presence of the disembodied. I'm using a term that Michelle, I think, preferred, because to the experiencer, it feels like this person is not deceased. They're just disembodied. Their consciousness is disembodied. And the experiencer might have this sense of presence without any specific sensory content. So they might not see anything, hear anything, feel anything, kinesthetically, but they have the definite sense that, someone is here, and a particular person, and maybe even have a sense of communication of message and that sort of thing, but it's done purely through mental kind of mind-to-mind communication. Again, no clear content. And then there are experiences with sensory content, and probably the most common is visual, that the individual, the experiencer, sees the deceased loved one, the disembodied loved one. But there also are auditory ones where they hear, and I should say, even within all of these, there are a lot of variations. If you just stay with visual for a minute, sometimes the experiencer will see the disembodied person just like you and I are seeing each other right now at solid 3D. They look like they are there. And then sometimes their whole body will appear, but it's more translucent. Or, as I was talking to a woman a couple days ago who contacted me because she'd had some difficulties talking about her ADC with people, and that's another thing we'll talk about later. And her mother appeared as a hologram at the foot of her bed, and she said it's like line by line, she saw her mother's body take shape. And then, but even when she was done, it was more like she was a hologram rather than a solid. And then sometimes people just see part of the body, and so it and usually includes the head and face, but might be only to here or down to the waist and that sort of thing. If the experience is this is true for in all cases, that the visual may be out in the environment, or it might be in the person's own mind's eye that they see the deceased, the disembodied loved one. And but even when it's in their mind's eye, it feels absolutely real most of the time. So in the auditory, the same thing. They might hear their disembodied loved ones saying something, either sounding like it's coming from the environment or in their mind's ear, so to speak, within their mind. They might smell something. And again, usually when people have a smell, they think that it's out in the environment, but actually it can be in their mind's nose, if that makes any sense, that they smell things that other people around them don't smell. But this would be like a scent that's very uniquely associated with the disembodied loved one. So it might be like their favorite perfume, or if they smoked a particular brand of cigar, you might smell that cigar smoke, that sort of thing. And it also can be tactile. And again, people sometimes have the experience of, it seems like their disembodied loved one is there actually touching them, but sometimes they feel the touch even though they don't see anything in the environment. And the touch can be anything from, a father whose daughter used to when she wanted to express affection, she'd take him by the arm like this and kind of shake his arm, and he felt that happen. Or it could be like a hug. And not atypically, people awaken from sleep to feeling something like somebody sitting on the foot of the bed. And then when they wake up, they see their deceased loved one. So it can be indirect tactile too, of affecting things that the person then feels. So there also are symbolic ADCs, and these are experiences in which the person, the experiencer, encounters something that is highly symbolic of their disembodied loved one, but it's happening out in the environment. And so the reason that I use butterflies in this presentation is because that's a very common type of symbolic ADC. I had an ADC involving butterflies, and also can be dragonflies, birds, cardinals seem to be a favorite. I'm not sure why, but it also can be something like hearing a favorite song of the disembodied loved one at a particularly meaningful time, like turning on the radio and here starts this song. Or it can be flowers blooming at, especially at unusual times. Like one man, it was the first anniversary of his mother's passing, and she had loved irises, and he had irises planted in his front yard, but it was the dead of winter. It was like mid-January, and the irises, usually don't come up until March or April. And on the anniversary of her first anniversary of her passing, he stepped out his front door, and through the snow, all the irises in his yard had bloomed. And so that's a symbolic ADC. Like, that really seems like she had something to do with that. And then there are also electronic ADCs where people, if any of you have seen the movie The Fabelmans, Steven Spielberg's memoir about his childhood, at one point his mother answers the phone in the middle of the night, and it's her mother, but the mother has just passed, and she's got her mother on the phone, except her mother's already moved on. But other electronic ones, like in addition to telephone calls from the dead, which there's a whole book about that if you're interested in that. Messages through the computer, messages on phones. I remember one of my Friends of IANDS group members, his wife had passed, and she and her daughter had gone shopping for the daughter's wedding dress together when they knew that the mother was terminally ill, and then the mother passed before the wedding actually happened. So about a month after the wedding, the daughter texts her father and she says, "Check out my Facebook page. I just posted my favorite picture of me in my wedding dress." So he goes to that page, he sees the photo, it's great, he likes it. Then he's looking down the list of likes, and his wife, who died a few months before the wedding, liked the photo. And he said to me, the weird thing is, the only way she ever accessed Facebook was on her phone. I have her phone, but I don't have her password. I can't get into it. So no one had access to her Facebook page except her. She somehow managed to like her daughter's Facebook entry. So those are also very interesting. And also another real common electronic form is like flashing lights. A person will walk into a room, and at dinner time, when they used to always sit down with their, let's say, disembodied husband or spouse, and the lights will flash. And doorbells ring, microwaves beep and go off, and broken things work. One of my favorites is, I'm going to forget his name. He's a major psychic skeptic, and he was getting married, and he and his fiance decided that they would get married at their house in the backyard. They had a huge backyard, and they could have this like yard party. So a month or two before the wedding, a package arrived, and it was from a relative who had found some things of her father's, and he had passed some years back, and was sending them to her, like in case she would like them. And one of them was a transistor radio. And so this the skeptic guy was trying to get the radio to work, and he couldn't make it work. So they just kind of stuck it in a drawer in a back room of the house. And so the wedding day comes, and I forgot to say that the woman that was getting married had been raised primarily by her grandfather, so he was very dear to her. So the wedding day comes, and things are starting to get, toward time for people to arrive, and she pulls her fiance. She's come in the house for a minute, and they sit down, and she said, "I just need to tell you that I'm just missing my grandfather so much right now. I just so wish he was here. And I just wanted to share that with you." And just then they hear music coming from the back of the house. And yes, you guessed it. When they went back, like, where is that coming from? They opened the drawer, and it's that transistor radio that they couldn't get to work that suddenly started playing music. It was her grandfather's. So, but even that didn't entirely, he just thought that could be a coincidence. Like, okay, right, whatever. Usually after-death communication is an individual experience, but the experiences can be shared. And I'll tell you one story of a shared one. Sometimes the experience is shared like right in the moment, like two people are together and they both see their disembodied child or pet or whatever. But sometimes it can happen in different ways. The very first person, I think, who ever told me about her ADC was a near-death experiencer. Her name also was Jan, like mine, but Jan Van Thurno is her name. And we had talked, I'd interviewed her actually about her NDE. And after that, we were chatting, and she told me this story that when she and her husband had been married just a couple of years and they had an infant, his mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and there was nothing to be done. So she and her husband and the baby moved into her house and cared for her almost a year until she passed. And during that year, Jan and her husband became pregnant. And so when when Jan's mother-in-law passed, Jan was pregnant. She hadn't had her second baby yet. She was about 2 months away. And they cleaned everything out, gave all the clothes away, sold the house, and moved into their own house for the first time in their marriage. And then Jan had the second baby. And just a couple weeks after Jan was home from the hospital, from the delivery, she woke up in the middle of the night, and there at the foot of her bed, and the disembodied seem to like this place a lot. A lot of people see their disembodied at the foot of their bed in the middle of the night. She saw her mother-in-law there. And she was, of course, surprised, but especially surprised because her mother-in-law was wearing a jumper that Jan had made for her that she always told Jan was her favorite dress. And what was confusing is Jan knew that she had given that dress to charity, but here was her mother-in-law standing there wearing this dress. And Jan said to her out loud, her husband was asleep, and Jan didn't have the wherewithal to like wake him up and go, "Your mom's here." She just said, what are you doing here? And the mother-in-law didn't answer. She just turned around and started walking out of the room. So Jan got out of bed and followed her, and she went into the older child's room and was just watching him sleep. And then when he started to like rustle, the mother-in-law turned and walked out of the room, went into the baby's room, watched him as he was sleeping. And again, when he started to rustle, she turned and left the room. Jan's just following her. And when she left the baby's room, she walked down the hall and just disappeared. And Jan had the very distinct sense that she was just coming to check on everybody and make sure everybody was okay. So the next morning, Jan tells her husband what happened, and they're like amazed. But they decide, well, they're not going to tell anybody because, you know, people might not understand and think they're crazy and all the stuff. We're going to talk about that later too. And so they never told anybody. So fast forward a few months, and her husband's family is having a family reunion. And it gets to be late at night. All the children have gone to bed. The adults are sitting around drinking adult beverages. And Jan's sister-in-law, her husband's sister, says, okay, you guys, I need to tell you something. And they're like, okay. And she said, you've got to believe me. I wasn't imagining this. She said, a few months ago, I woke up in the middle of the night and Mom was standing at the end of my bed. And then she turned to Jan and she said, you know, the weird thing, remember that jumper you made for her that she always said was her favorite dress? She was wearing that. So the mother-in-law appeared to her daughter wearing the same dress as she appeared to Jan. So it's a kind of a shared experience, or a cross confirmation sort of experience. And these cases can be veridical. And let's see if I can get this to play. Now, are you seeing this on your screen?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. I'll just make it full screen. And
Mod Pizza
and
now has wings.
I'll
Wings
count down the
big
ad.
wing.
Okay, we can now skip that. Here's John with his veridical ADC.
My father had passed away, and I was at home helping my mother get things in order. And I knew that he had had a gun, that it was a small 22 caliber pistol that she knew nothing about. And I knew that I needed to go and get my hands on it because she wouldn't know what to do with it. So I looked all over the house while I was at home visiting and being with her during this time. And I looked everywhere I could in the normal place it was at, and it was not there. Well, a few days went by and I had gone into his office and looked through his desk and his things there, and I couldn't find it there. Looked in his car, I couldn't find it there. And then one day, a few days into this whole thing, I had a dream. And the dream was, I was in the kitchen of the house that I grew up in, and I was walking down the stairs to the basement, and my father was like, he was talking to me off screen and telling me what to do. Oh, go downstairs and go. And I kept saying, Dad, I've already looked down here. It's not down here. He said, no, go down into my dark room. And I said, I've looked in your dark room, and I'm yelling up the stairs. And so he said, nope, go into the dark room and go behind the cabinet against the wall. And between the wall and the cabinet, you will find the pistol is in there, wedged between the wall. And that was a dream. And the next morning I woke up and I just kind of discounted it. I never really did much about it. But then a few days went by again, and I said, you know, I might go down there and take a look. And sure enough, I went downstairs and I looked behind the wall, and there it was, exactly where he had told me it was in a dream. And it was, and I have it now. I removed it from the house, and I still have that exact pistol, but it was never told to me ever that that's where it was, because that's never where he kept it. He always kept it up in his closet, a very top shelf of his closet. And he didn't tell anybody that he had it, and he didn't tell anybody where it was. And from that point on, I just knew. I just knew that there was something more.
I want to tell you a story.
I want you to be
I used to believe that.
Okay, there we go.
So Jan, just so you know, we can hear, but we actually can't see the video.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, all it was his talking head, so you didn't miss much. As long as you could hear it, that's the important thing. Yeah. I just love how he ends that little testimonial by saying, that's when I knew that there's something more. And this is actually I'm going to come back to the veridical aspect, but the fact that his worldview changed, that's something that Michelle found in her study of the Australian ADCers, that if the ADC experiencer, what we call an ADCer, already believed in the survival of consciousness after death, the ADC just confirmed that. If they didn't already believe in that, the ADC shifted them to believing in it. So people come out of this experience either with a confirmed sense of afterlife or shifted to a sense of that there is an afterlife. But the veridical aspect is that he learned in his dream the location of the gun that apparently no living person knew. And there are many cases actually of this type of thing. People who were told about the location of a hidden insurance policy. In one case, the person's father had passed, and they actually were kind of desperately in need of the insurance money. And I don't remember how the ADC came, but the policy itself, if you imagine opening, you have a nightstand with like 3 drawers in it, and you open the top drawer and then reach up under, there, he had it taped up underneath there in a place that no one would ever find it if you didn't know to look there. And they learned from the ADC where to locate that. Another woman found an insurance policy in a closet hidden under some shoe boxes. And so those are cases that indicate that, at least in some cases, the experiencer apparently is communicating with the actual disembodied loved one, communicating information to them that later turns out to be accurate. And that's very idiosyncratic and in many cases impossible to have known through normal physical means. And those indicate that at least those experiences are real, and they lend credibility to the experiences that involve, just the disembodied person appearing and saying, I just want you to know how much I love you and that I'm fine and I'm happy. Well, there's nothing verifiable in that, but these cases of veridical perception, lend credibility to those cases that can't be verified. So the circumstances, they occur in all states of health, from being perfectly healthy all the way to being on one's deathbed. And the deathbed is actually a prime place for after-death communication, where the dying person sees deceased loved ones who appear to, they seem to be appearing in order to facilitate the dying person's transition from physical existence to non-physical existence. And an example that I remember from a good friend of mine, his name is Michael, and his father, Sicilian family, his father's name was Mobs, and Mobs was in the hospital and expected not to live. And Michael came to visit him one night, and another little historical thing you need to know, Mobs's youngest sister had died like 20 years before from complications around birth and giving birth. And Michael came to visit Mobs one evening, and Mobs said, Vicky's here. And that's his youngest sister. And Michael's like, oh, like, where is she? And Mobs said, she's up in the corner there, but she's got her back to me and she won't turn around. And Michael's like, oh. And then the next night, Michael came, and Mobs told him, Vicky turned around. I can see her face, but she still won't talk to me. The next night, Michael came, and Mobs was talking with Vicky, having a conversation, and still able, when Michael walked in, he's like, who are you talking to? He said, Vicky, she's talking to me now. And Michael's like, oh. And then Michael left, and that night, Mobs died. So that's the kind of deathbed, a typical deathbed ADC. But people have these experiences when they're perfectly healthy. They occur in all states of consciousness. So the experiencer might be awake, they might be asleep, they might be meditating. They've happened in comas. When people regain consciousness after a coma, they'll report having had ADC during their coma. And of course, famously in near-death experiences that people meet deceased loved ones who are often there to convey that the living person really should go back. It is likely that sleep ADC is most common. And normally when I'm teaching a class and we have a lot of interactive ability, I ask, why do you think that might be? And people just kind of know intuitively that when we're asleep, our defenses are down. And so we're more open and have greater access, or maybe I should say that the disembodied have greater access to us. We're less distracted, so we can, focus more on an ADC experience. So that may be why they happen most often during sleep, but they certainly do happen in all states. However, when they do occur in sleep, I know John Wigglesworth that we just heard referred to his experience as a dream, but most ADCers will say, well, I was asleep, but it wasn't a dream. It felt absolutely real, both during the experience and after. They wake up in the morning and it's like, yeah, that was a real experience. Unlike when we wake up from our dreams and we know that however real it felt while we were in the dream, we know that it was, quote unquote, just a dream. With ADC, the person wakes up and they have the sense of reality that remains. And unlike dreams, these, which are very ephemeral, you've probably had the experience of awakening in the morning, remembering a dream and thinking, oh, I've got to think about that more later in the day. And then you get to later in the day, it's like, I know I had a dream, but I can't remember what it was about. These experiences, ADCs, remain fixed and unchanged in people's memories for decades, much like near-death experiences do. And I had a doctoral student, now Dr. Farnoosh Nouri, who grew up until early teens in Iran. And she said in Persian, they have two words for sleep experiences. One is roya, which means dream. And now I'll probably, if any of you are Iranian, I apologize for how I'm about to butcher this, but it's roya sedehe, which means a true vision. And so they in Persian, there's the distinction between dreams during sleep and true visions during sleep. And so English just doesn't have that nuance of differentiation, but maybe if we just called them sleep visions rather than sleep, rather than dreams, that would be more accurate. The frequency, they can occur only once or multiple times to the same person, and it might be the same disembodied loved one coming back multiple times, or it might be different disembodied loved ones coming in, or any combination of those. Usually, but not always, they decrease over time, but they can occur decades later, after, when the person is far from, they're way over the grieving process. Not that the grieving process ever entirely ends, but they're past the great bulk of their grief, and suddenly they have an ADC. And I'll give you an example of that in a minute. The incidence is about 3/4 of people report ADC in the first year after the death of a loved one. It is very common. Like, you would never know it from our culture, which doesn't prepare us for this reality. But this is what Jenny found through all those studies of all those people. And prevalence, which means incidence, is like, after a particular incident, how often does the thing happen? So after the death of the loved one, how often does it happen? Prevalence is if you were just going to walk down the street and ask people, have you had ADC? Have you had ADC? about a third of people will report that they experienced it sometime in their life. So again, very prevalent. It does occur more often in cultures that are ADC friendly. For example, I think Iceland is like what perhaps the most I don't know if it's the most, but it's one of the most ADC friendly cultures, and people report it more often there. What we don't know is, do they experience it more often there, or do they feel safe to report it more because their culture is ADC friendly? We really don't know. And some of, I'm teaching a course on transpersonal phenomena this semester at the university that I used to be full-time employed at. And one of my students is from India, and she's like, "Oh yeah, this is this is common in my culture, and the same in Hispanic culture, much more accepted, expected, acknowledged, and so forth." So so there is a role, but it's not a determinant, because a lot of Americans have ADC, and I should say not American, but a lot of people from European heritage, which those cultures tend, well, and it isn't European, because the Hispanic Anglo cultures tend not to be as ADC friendly, but people from those cultures report them anyway. It's another case of, you can believe what you want, but here's what's really going to happen. Experience or demographics, it happens to both people who are bereaved and non-bereaved. A lot of times people think it only happens if you're grieving, but that is absolutely not true. And a case of non-bereaved is, this is from what you'll find out later, why I'm about to say that the single best book on after-death communication, I think, is the book that's kind of maybe unfortunately titled Hello from Heaven, but it's a study by Bill Guggenheim and Judy Guggenheim of thousands of after-death communications, where they categorize them and that sort of thing. And one of the stories in that book, it's just full of ADC testimonials. And one of them is, a woman one day is driving home from work, and she is taking her usual route. She gets to a particular intersection with a stop sign, and suddenly she hears her father's voice, he's been dead for 10 years, say to her, "Turn right, right here, right now." So she's like, okay. So she turns right, and then she's going down this street, and she's like, well, now, how am I going to get home now? So she has to end up taking this roundabout route to get home. Takes her much longer than usual to get home. Anyway, she gets home, takes off her coat, pours herself a glass of wine, flips on the TV, and sees breaking news that on the route she normally takes home, a bridge that she normally crosses had collapsed. And before anybody knew it, 3 cars had gone into the ravine and people had died. It was very likely that if she had continued on the route she was taking, she might have been one of those cars. So her father came after years of being gone to protect her from possible death. However, the incidence is higher among the bereaved. And the incidence is always highest in that first year following the beloved one's death. It occurs to both men and women. However, women report ADC more often. Now, we don't know whether that's because they have it more often, or because they, for some reason, feel safer to or just more daring or willing to say what they've experienced. But in any case, women do report it more than men, but it definitely happens to both sexes. Other than those two things, the higher tendency among the bereaved, higher tendency for report among women, this is an equal opportunity experience. So any other demographic you can think of, like age or level of education or belief system or desire for the experience or fear of the experience. I mean, none of those things is a factor in the experience happening more often to some people than others. It's pretty much an equal opportunity transpersonal experience. And importantly, there is no relationship between after-death communication and mental disorder, even though people sometimes have been diagnosed with a mental disorder for hallucinating, and it's because their hallucinations which we're going to talk about more in more depth here in a minute, but when they occur like with schizophrenia or with high fever, it represents a regression of functioning. The person has somehow is losing touch with reality, and they're in a reality that isn't shared with other people. Well, in transpersonal experiences, people also have experiences that feel absolutely real that oftentimes are not shared by others. If someone doesn't understand the difference between a transpersonal experience that occurs to a well-functioning person, somebody who's just chugging along in life just fine, and they also have a drop-in visit from their, disembodied loved one, and somebody who's hallucinating, the person hearing it might assume that this transpersonal experience is really a pre-personal experience and will erroneously diagnose the person with some regressive, like schizophrenia or something. So it's really important to know that in these, this vast amount of studies, it's been just observed over and over that there's no relationship to mental disorder. Now, that doesn't mean that people with mental disorders don't have ADC, but they don't have it any more often than people without mental disorder. So, okay, and the effects. The effects are overwhelmingly positive. People, what Jenny found was that people describe the experiences as pleasant, elating, positive, comforting, and healing. As I mentioned, Michelle found that it either affirmed or changed people's belief in the survival of consciousness after death, which was very affirming and comforting. The idea that, we live on when our bodies stop, our consciousness lived on. This is what I already told you. And I did a study one time. I mean, there's a longer story behind why I did this study, but I'm just going to cut to the chase and say, I was interested in the question because sometimes after-death communication is demonized by especially conservative religious perspectives. Sometimes perceive ADC as somehow evil or of the devil. And I just wasn't seeing evidence of that, but no one had ever actually researched that exact topic. So I drew from the passage in the Bible that a minister told me years ago is the Christian, anyway, litmus test, because it's in the New Testament, of whether something derives from Holy Spirit or not. And the passage from Galatians goes that the fruit of the Spirit is meaning that if someone has an experience that yields this fruit, then the experience can be assumed to come from Holy Spirit. And the fruits are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And so what I did for the study, I did a survey. I had a few hundred people respond, which was a good response rate. And I asked them, it was, I invited people who remembered having had an ADC. And so, so I asked them, how many of you had? And if they had had only one, I asked them to think about that one as they answered the following questions. And if they'd had more than one, I asked them to identify out of all the ones they've had, the one that they consider to be most significant for whatever reason, significant for their reasons, and to keep that one in mind as they answer these questions. And so I didn't say anything about the Bible or evil or any of that stuff. I just said, how many ADCs have you had? Think about either the only one or the most significant one and answer these questions. What effect did that experience have on your sense of love? Did it strongly decrease it, moderately decrease it, no effect, moderately increase it, or strongly increase it? Actually, I had strongly, moderately, slightly, no change, slightly, moderately, strongly. And then thank you. And what effect did this experience have on your sense of joy? And then peace, patience, kindness. I went through all the fruits of the spirit. And then when they were finished, I just said, thank you very much. And then I tabulated all of their responses. And if you imagine the scores or they're answering yes, that strongly increased is over here and strongly decreased is over here. It was like this. It was like the vast majority of people had an increase in one or more of the fruits with no decrease. In some cases, the ADC didn't affect that particular fruit, so there was just like no change. And then there was a small percentage, 1% of people who reported having and it was always one fruit decrease as the result of the ADC. And of course, we looked carefully at those to find out what was happening. And one of the things we saw was that those respondents responded in ways that as mental health professionals, we recognized as possible, like depression. Like one person said, it just made me more anxious to get out of this hellhole that's life. It's kind of like that person might be depressed. And then the other thing that we got was people who just seemed to be confused and didn't have a context to understand the experience they'd had. I have a hunch that oh yeah, so there are the fruits of the spirit. And so they're, they're just overwhelmingly positive and just rarely negative. Oh, we did have one person that the ADC itself was distressing, and that was somebody whose disembodied loved one visited repeatedly, and they found that every time there was a visit, it intensified their longing for the person. They're missing the person in their grief, and so they kind of wish the person wouldn't come anymore. So that can happen, that a person leaves the experience feeling more aggrieved. But for most people, what I like to say when I lecture about grief is grief involves three questions. Where and how is my loved one? How am I supposed to go on in life without them? And am I ever going to see them again? And what ADC answers is the first and third question. And because people usually appear in the prime of life, they are happy and healthy and convey that, and that they're perfectly good. And they also tend to convey, that they love the living person, and the experience itself convinces the living person that they are going to see, that not only are they going to see this person again, their deceased, their disembodied loved one, but that their disembodied loved one is actually with them, but just in a very different form than they used to be, not as easily accessible. So it's very comforting, and that can actually help answer the question, how am I going to move on in life without them? Because it's no longer a sense that I'm disconnected, but I have a continuing bond, a continuing connection with them. And that can help me move on with a little bit lighter heart. So, so these experiences are just by and large, very beneficial. As I said, there are distressing responses, but they're rare, and they're typically connected to either confusion or fear due to a lack of information or misinformation about what ADC is. Like they may have been taught that they are of the devil when actually they promote the fruit of the spirit. They promote spiritual growth. And that's the belief system incompatible with the experience is what can be distressing. Okay, so an important topic in ADC is about disclosure issues, and both professional ethics and most people's personal morals involve the principle of doing no harm. But similar to near-death experiences, and I actually studied this with near-death experiencers about their experiences disclosing to healthcare providers, and a third of them feeling harmed by the experience. ADC confidants can harm people who disclose an ADC by the same things as with NDEs, denying the experience, like failing to recognize it as an ADC. The person says, you know, I had this experience last night of this dream, and my mother came, it was so real. And the person's like, oh, that's weird. You know, that doesn't help to respond that way. So it's important to recognize, to be able to say, wow, it sounds like you might have had what's called after-death communication. Tell me more about it. Dismissing it as invalid or unimportant, like saying, oh yeah, those dreams, that's just nonsense. That is not helpful. And it's also not realistic, because they are more than nonsense if they have these powerful effects on people. Diagnosing the ADC or the experiencer as having a mental disorder, as we said before, and demonizing the ADC as evil or of the devil. So these, what I call the Ds, denying, dismissing, diagnosing, demonizing, are not helpful when somebody discloses an ADC. What is helpful is to recognize it as an ADC, not force that label on the person, but say, you know, there is this phenomenon that's like a known thing where people have experiences of communication with their disembodied loved ones. And it's called after-death communication. And saying, wow, it sounds like that it might be an important experience to you. Tell me more about it. What did it mean to you? And not diagnosing the person or implying that there's anything mental disorder oriented around this situation, and not demonizing them or the experience. In fact, what I call pneumonize the experience, talk about how, you know, these experiences often have both psychological and spiritual beneficial effects on people if they know how to mine the experience for those riches. So here's some interesting stuff about recent media coverage. The Walrus did an article on why do we see dead people, and there's the link in case you and if you're interested, I can give Angie the PowerPoint handout for this if you want to follow up on any of this stuff. The strengths of this article were that they did a really good job of covering early history of ADC research, really good job. And but it had a lot of weaknesses. They had very little current research, despite the fact that really important current research has been done. And there was no attempt to counter use of the term grief hallucination, which is, there's, as you're going to see here, there is no basis for referring to these as hallucinations. And then many of you have probably seen the movie Ghost. And in this article from 2021, KERA, the National Public Radio Station in Dallas, did a Think program on how seeing ghosts can actually be good for us. There's the link to that one. And the strengths of this is that they accurately represented ADC overall. But again, some important weaknesses. They repeatedly used the term hallucination, which degrades the experience and misrepresents it. Because ADCs are not hallucinations. Here's a really careful comparison of hallucinations and ADC. After a hallucination, the person says, even though the hallucination felt absolutely real, just like dreams, while you're in it, afterwards they look back and go, what? Well, I was out of my mind. After an ADC, the person was likely to be adamant that their experience was real. In hallucinations with like high fever, schizophrenia are usually distressing in nature, whereas ADCs are usually profoundly pleasurable, a brief reunion with the disembodied loved one. For hallucinations, the memory of them fades as it does with dreams and just even normal memories, whereas the memory remains vivid even decades later. People don't want to think about their hallucinations because they perceive them to be meaningless, whereas people usually really want to revisit the ADC because they find a lot of meaning, comfort, value, and so forth in it. And there are no specific after effects of hallucinations. They come and go and, no known after effects. Whereas people, as you saw, benefit spiritually and psychologically from ADC. So they're just not the same thing, even though what they have in common is that they're a subjective experience that usually isn't shared with other people. And it is an experience of something that goes beyond consensus reality. But beyond that, they're just completely different. And most recently, just this past March 10th, Ira Glass did an NPR program that was titled The Problem with Ghosts. And there's the link to it. And the strength of it was one, is that it was an 8-minute segment, and he had the testimony of one ADCer whose mother visited her 3 times after the mother's passing. But the weaknesses are, Ira never used the term ADC. He said that it was a well-known psychological phenomenon that Freud had called wishful psychosis. And he cited only one 1970s Welsh study of widows and widowers, despite the fact that, as Jenny found, there have been now more than 35 studies, and Evelyn's study and all this stuff. I mean, it was just so out of date. And the ADCer is questioning her experience, what was that? And Ira just did not help her at all in the way he responded. And she was disappointed because she didn't get what she wanted, which was for her mother to tell her she loved her, which her mother had never been. She said her mother wasn't a gushy person even in life. So she was, in her after-death communication, she was true to her personality. And Ira said, this is the problem with ghosts. They don't do what we want them to do. And that is not true. Now, it is true that there's a good number of people who would like after-death communication who don't seem to be able to get it. We'll talk about why that is later. But when people have it, almost always the ghost does exactly what they want. They say, I'm fine. I love you. I'm going to see you again. I'm always with you. And, go on and enjoy your life. And what more important messages could there be? So, so he was just wrong about that. And that's the most, that even after NPR did the Think one that was better, he still is like so out of it. I had this fantasy of emailing him and say, "Dear Mr. Glass, as we say in Texas, bless your heart." You know, that's what we say when somebody's like being ignorant or, you know, ornery or something like that. And give him some references about, you know, what's really going on with ADC. One good publication that came out was in 2021, and it was on CNN in their health section. And there's the link to it. And it was an overall accurate representation of ADC. ADCs were referred to as experiences. Never once did they refer to them as hallucinations, like thank you. And several cases were provided by social worker Scott Jansen, who has observed, he's witnessed ADC as a hospice social worker. So it was really good. And I couldn't find any weaknesses in it. This was really top notch. So, so if you want to read something good recently, this is the one I recommend. So, if someone discloses an ADC to you, just remember to avoid harm by not disregarding, but recognizing and offering the label ADC. Don't refer to it as a hallucination. Don't dismiss it, but affirm its potential importance and value to the person. Don't pathologize it. Confirm that ADC is unrelated to mental disorder. And a lot of times, because the experience falls outside of consensus reality, people might say, as they're about to say it, this might sound crazy, but I saw my mother last night. Or they might say, like, I don't know if I'm losing it. And so to be able to say, I can tell you that this is unrelated to mental disorder, you know, and look, you're functioning fine in life. Everything's good. And you had this experience that like millions, billions of other people have had. It's not mental disorder. But so let's just turn our attention to what you experienced and what you make of it and that kind of thing. Don't demonize the experience. Do convey that these experiences are usually spiritually beneficial. And when Jenny finished her study, I know of all those 35 studies that had been published since the late 1800s, one day when she was almost finished, you know, with all everything related to her dissertation, I said, you probably maybe the best read person on ADC on the planet. You've read everything that's been written, both in peer-reviewed journals and popular books, and she read everything. And I said, if somebody came up to you and said, if I were going to read just one thing about after-death communication, what would you recommend? She thought for a minute and she said, the Guggenheim and Guggenheim book, Hello from Heaven. So that's why I recommended it earlier on. I also, since then, since Jenny published her study in 2011, and in 2017, I wrote a chapter on ADC in a book that is available to read for free online. And the reference to that is in the references section. I'll point it out. So you could go there this afternoon and read a lot of what I said actually in this presentation. Probably don't need to read it. And then recently, those two booklets by Evelyn, Investigation of the Phenomenology and Impact of Spontaneous and Direct After-Death Communications. Cases is one of the booklets and Research Findings is the other. So the research findings are all the statistics and the cases are lots of the stories. And so here are those references. And here is let's see, I guess I can't get my cursor to work, but the second Holden reference there is the one that is available, library.unt.edu/ Aquiline Books /connecting 008 3/ and again, like I said, I'll give this to Angie if anybody wants it, this handout. And here are the two Alsacer ones at the start. I highly recommend Bruce Grayson's book After, which is actually about near-death experiences, but those include after-death communication. So there's a lot of treatment of that in there. There's the Guggenheim's book. This Holden is about the harmful, both helpful and harmful disclosure experiences of near-death experiencers that I think applies equally to ADCers. And then that chapter on ADC, this is the Holden, Langford, and Holmes is the one about ADC and the biblical fruit of the spirit. And then there's Michelle Knight's, if you want to read her dissertation, and then Jenny's, if you want to read hers. And that, I think, is it. And if anybody has questions, I'll stop sharing here. If anybody has questions or comments or would like to tell your ADC story, or hear more stories from me, I'm happy to share.
Definitely have people interested in getting those references so that they can look up
Yeah.
those.
I'll send those to you and you'll be able to email them out.
Thank you so much. And people are liking the reference to the Hello from Heaven book as well.
Right.
So I have a quick question for you. At the beginning, you talked about when you're doing grief counseling and facilitating after-death communication with people who are grieving. And so I'm very interested in that. And just what exactly does that involve?
Yeah, I completely forgot to talk about that, and it's a big deal. Let me put my hearing aids back in. My phone was ringing, and it rings in my hearing aids, so I just had to take them out. So shortly before I retired, about 3 years before I retired, I did a study of induced after-death communication. So I'm gonna give you a little bit kind of long discussion about this. This phenomenon was discovered by a psychologist named Al Botkin, who was working in Chicago at the VA with combat veterans who had PTSD. And he was using EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And this is a counseling technique that was discovered by a gal named Shapiro that involves, especially for processing traumatic memories. Yeah, there's the therapist moves their fingers in front of the client's eyes and the client watches and then closes their eyes as they're thinking about the traumatic memory. And in the process of doing this, visiting the memory with this thing going on, the person processes the memory differently and it loses its traumatic impact. And since then, she and others have discovered that this with eyes is just one form of what's called bilateral stimulation. So it can be two sounds, right, left, right, left, right, left. It could be tapping on two sides of the body, but bilateral, both sides. And the stimulation is this rhythmic back and forth thing. And what it seems to do in a way, I mean, this is speculation about why it works, is that it seems to kind of center a person. And whereas we tend to be left brain dominant in our culture, this seems to kind of center the person and like bring both sides of the brain into equal play that enables them to process the memory in a different way that actually then changes, and they no longer get the terrifying dreams at night and other kinds of really troublesome things that happen. Hang on a second. So one day he's working with a veteran man, and the VA program there was residential. So people came and stayed there for sometimes weeks at a time, and he would see a patient every day. So he sees this man who's been there a little less than a week, and they've been doing EMDR for 5 or 6 days. And this time, Al does this, and I know what happened. They finished really processing the traumatic memory that the soldier had brought up, and there was still about like 10 minutes left in the session. And so Al said, well, why don't we just throw in another set of eye movements and see what happens? And, maybe something helpful will happen. So he does this, the guy closes his eyes and he bursts into tears. And Al's like, oh my gosh, what's going on here? And the guy is weeping and weeping. And then after about 3 minutes, he breaks out into this huge smile, and he's like beaming. And then he opens his eyes, and Al says what you always say when they open their eyes, like, what's happening? And the guy said, I saw her. And Al says, who? And the vet says, Lee, L-L-I. And Al's thinking, Lee, like, who is this? And then he vaguely remembers that when he did the intake for this patient, the patient reported that at one point in his tour of duty in Vietnam, his troop had been stationed out in the jungle where they lived essentially, and they did their missions from their camp. And orphans would find their way to the camp because the soldiers would give them food and chocolate and all this stuff. Well, this guy at that time had a daughter at home who was 11, and one of the orphans there was an 11-year-old girl, and he had like this fatherly attachment to her, and her name was Lee. And so they probably had been 2-3 weeks, where he saw her every day and gave her food and, got to know her and stuff like that. And then one day, the truck came from the large city nearby that had an orphanage. They'd heard about these orphans, and they were coming to collect them and bring them back to the orphanage. So the soldiers are loading all the kids onto the truck, and they're he's bidding a tearful goodbye to Lee, mutually tearful. And he's telling her, I'm going to find you and adopt you and bring you back to the US, which he didn't even know that soldiers weren't allowed to do that. But anyway, suddenly shots ring out, and there's a sniper, a Viet Cong sniper. So they scramble the kids off the truck, and everybody lie face down, and and a few soldiers go off, and after a few minutes of where there's been more gunfire and stuff, they finally hear a lot of gunfire and then silence, and then they get the all clear that the sniper has been killed. So then they gather the children up, start getting them back in the bus, and he's looking around like he can't find Lee. And he goes around near the front of the truck, and there she's lying on the ground, and she's dead. She's been shot and killed by that sniper. And he said it was a more painful loss than even the time that they were walking through the jungle and his buddy got blown up, by a hidden device. Yeah. And so Al's like, okay, Lee. And the guy said, yeah, she was there. And he said, she's grown up. And he said, she's in her early 30s now, which she would be chronologically. And he's saying, she thanked me for what I did for her. And then at the end, she came and hugged me, and I felt her arms around me. And it was just the most beautiful thing. And so Al is like, okay, because Al is just like, very traditionally trained. ADC is not a word in his vocabulary. And so he just makes sure the guy is like, okay. and leaves the session because Al's got his next patient coming. Well, what happened was when this patient came back, he had no more traumatic memories. And in a matter of 3 days, he was so consistently fine that they just discharged him, and they had expected him to stay, for a few weeks.
Mm.
And that really struck Al. So long story short, Al refined this technique of facilitating after-death communication in counseling sessions. So the way that it works now, in a nutshell, is that when a client comes in, I first find out just, about who their disembodied loved one is, their relationship with them, what this person meant to them, and all that kind of stuff, the history stuff. And then the next phase, there are like 3 phases or 4 phases to this. The next phase is that I ask the client, what is the most painful aspect of your grief? And once we identify what that most painful aspect is, we do EMDR or bilateral stimulation processing. It isn't exactly the same as EMDR. It's close, but not a couple differences, but not important for our purposes here. And the person processes, and they'll say, like, you start out saying, and on a scale from 1 to 10, how bad is that worst aspect? And people usually say 8, 9, or 10, it's really up there bad. And then we do this processing that can take, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever. And at the end of which we say to the person, and how painful is that worst aspect now? And they'll say, it's not a problem, or it's still like a 1 or a 2, or maybe even a 3, but that's it. They come way down on how distressed they are about that. At that point, we do another set of eye movements or bilateral stimulation. Now, actually, we tap the backs of hands, and about half of patients have a spontaneous after-death communication with their disembodied loved one. And it can take any of those forms, that you saw, that might be that absolute sense of presence, or they might see them in their mind's eye, they might hear them, have conversations with them, and things like that. And for the people who don't have an ADC spontaneously, we then ask, if you could say one thing to your disembodied loved one, what's the single most important thing you would want to say to them? And once we figure out what that is, then we do bilateral stimulation, and another 25% of people have an ADC with that. Now, the study that I did, we took grieving people, and of course we told them all about what the study was about, but what I'm going to tell you, but this is what happened. When they came in, we randomly assigned them either to traditional grief therapy, which is mostly talk therapy, doing things like writing a letter to the disembodied and doing some kind of rituals and things like that, and figuring out how you're going to manage without them and stuff like that. And the other half we assigned to IADC, induced after-death communication, what I just described to you. And everybody got 2 sessions. So the way it worked is once we got them scheduled, they came in and completed a set of questionnaires about their grief. And then they immediately went into a 90-minute session, either traditional talk grief therapy or IADC. Then exactly a week later, they came back exactly the same time, went into their second 90-minute session, and then came right out of that, went and completed the questionnaires about grief. So you're looking at grief, a comparison of grief symptoms 1 week apart, with these 2 90-minute sessions and a week of time in between. And what we found in a nutshell was that the IADC people had a statistically significantly greater reduction in their grief symptoms, and the that's what's called statistical significance. And for anybody who knows anything about statistics, there's also practical significance, like clinically, how meaningful is this? And it was what has been termed a huge practical significance, a huge clinical effect. So, we had been having reports from people, from therapists who'd been trained in IADC doing this and seeing these remarkable shifts in their clients. And so this is the first time that it's really been documented subjectively. So we just know that it works. It does something. And interestingly, the people who did the traditional talk therapy for grief were made virtually no improvement, and some actually got worse. Whereas the IADC people all got better, and most substantially better. So now maybe traditional therapy over time is going to be more effective, but like, why do that? If you've got something that's going to help somebody right away with less time, less money, and so effective, why not do that for people? So, yeah.
In the IADC group, you bilateral stimulation, and half the people had an after-death communication.
I would say that I actually haven't, interestingly enough, I haven't looked at exactly how many people reported that they had ADC, but my sense is, because I watched all the sessions, that probably about 60% did. And then we had a couple of people who had spontaneous ADC the following week and came back at the session and said, I didn't have it during the session, but during the week, blah, 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 this happened. So, yeah.
What were the ADCs? How would you characterize the ADCs? Presumably.
All types. Well, except they tended to be more in the mind's eye because the person had their eyes closed. We tap the backs of their hands and then they close their eyes and stay in that posture, for 30 to 60 seconds, or sometimes more if a lot of stuff is happening. So it was in their mind's eye that they would see their disembodied loved one, they would feel the distinct presence of them, or they sometimes would get a communication from them with no sensory anything. And that didn't seem auditory. It was like there was mind-to-mind communication without any other indication of the presence of the person.
Because there seem to be two things going on in the IADC, and that is you've got the bilateral stimulation, and then you've got the additional after-death communication from a loved one who might pop in. I'm just wondering,
right?
Which
and
is
we don't know. We could not separate. Well, maybe we could to some degree, but that's another study to separate the effects of the two phases.
The ADC, because I imagine the bilateral by itself will do a lot of good, but if in addition the person gets an ADC, right, it's going to be
exactly right. And my understanding is that there's a study going on in Europe right now where they're comparing EMDR grief therapy with IADC. So they're doing the EMDR alone and comparing to see how effective they are. I can just tell you my impression is that the second phase, where you deal with that most painful aspect of the grief, is helpful. The ADC is qualitatively more helpful. Yeah, because it's that experience of ongoing connection with the loved one that brings so much relief.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's my impression.
How do you deal with a person who's bereaved and suffering greatly if they're really not sympathetic to the idea of an afterlife to begin with?
Actually, what Al has found, and what I know from our study as well, is that you can believe whatever you want, But when you get into the session, you're just as likely to have, in fact, Al believes that his patients have been more likely to experience ADC if they were a little skeptical. And the reason is that if I believe and I really want this, the grasping, the reaching, it puts me off balance. And whereas if I'm skeptical, I'm like centered and like, okay, like if it's there, like bring it on, but we'll see. And that centeredness seems to be more facilitative of having ADC. So that's what we found is that almost always when somebody doesn't have an ADC, it's because they have some emotional intensity that still is unresolved around the loss, and that emotional intensity gets in the way.
We have a question from someone. Could you please give contact information for scheduling an IADC for people?
Yeah. Actually, if you go to the website, induced after death communication, and even if you put in IADC and Al's last name, Botkin, Botkin, that'll take you to the IADC website. And there they have listed therapists who've been trained in IADC.
This is Al Bodkin's.
Yes. Well, I hesitate to say that it's his anymore because he's actually retired, but it is the IADC website. There's an ongoing organization, a small organization. Yeah.
So for people who would like to have more or some after-death communication with their loved ones, is there a practice that you would recommend that's safe? Because my is, you don't just invite anything in, you have to be very careful.
Yeah. So it's always a good idea in transpersonal processes in general to take protective action. So like say a protective prayer, even just state the affirmation that I invite only benevolent spirit and that all others are not welcome. But some people actually like to invoke protection from Jesus or, any way that helps you to feel protected. And then my only recommendation is to invite, not demand. If you're feeling desperate, that's going to get in the way. So it's important to try to get into a centered place of emotional equanimity, peace, calm, that sort of thing, and invite the disembodied to be present. And then, and this is in some ways the trickiest part, be open to how they communicate, because some communication seems to be easiest through electronics like flashing lights, some through auditory, some through symbolic, like finding pennies or being followed by a little flock of butterflies right after you've asked for something to be shown. And just being open to that the person may communicate in ways that the disembodied, in ways that may or may not seem characteristic of who they were before they passed. So it's just about being ready to receive the communication, however it can come. And then trying to keep a check on doubt, receive the message, say, if this was a message from you, I got it. It might help me to get something else if you can do that, that kind of thing.
It's from you and not wishful thinking.
Pardon me?
I'd be sure it's from the loved one and not my own wishful thinking.
Yes, and people sometimes wonder if it is, and yet usually the sense of the experience is so real that it's not an imagination or a fantasy, that I made up, sort of thing. And I could give you examples from my own experiences that point to that. But a lot of ADCers, I mean, by and large, ADCers have no doubt what they experienced. It's only when we have a culture that's unfriendly to ADCs, when people have just don't know about the phenomenon, they don't have a context for it, that they have trouble accepting what felt absolutely real, but how could that possibly be, sort of thing.
And are the people are the ADCers, do they always know who the loved one is who's communicating?
That's a great question. I think sort of by definition, they would have to, well, no, that's not true. Although I don't know if they would have known, because there have been cases, for example, where someone like a child talks, a child who had a near-death experience and was met by this really kind older man who held his hand the whole time and reassured him and was so nice and helpful, and the child like drowned in a swimming pool. Then they resuscitate him and the kid's back, and the child, this is actually an actual case where the child then a couple weeks later is eating lunch and he says to his mom, when my body was in the pool, I wasn't there. I was walking down a path with a really nice older man, and he was so nice. He just kept saying that I was okay, and pretty soon I'd be able to go back and be with you again. And he was just really, really nice. And the mother's like, okay, finish your, sandwich. And so then a couple of months later, they're visiting her sister, who is the sort of family archivist and has all the photos, the old photos and stuff like that. And the little boy happens to come in to ask permission to go do something. And they're on a particular page, and he glances down and he said, "Mommy, there's the man that was with me when my body was in the pool." And it was her father, his grandfather, who had died before he was born. And he'd never seen a picture of this man. He was only 4 years old. He'd never seen a picture of him before. And yet he recognized that was his grandfather. So yeah, I guess sometimes people don't know the identity that this is actually a relative of mine. But I think that's very much the minority of cases.
Well, the reason I ask the question is because sometimes people will have a sense of don't walk into that space, stop the car, turn right. But sometimes it's the higher self that's actually talking to us, not necessarily a love. So I'm wondering.
Right. Well, I don't think there's a way to determine in that case. It might be their higher self. It might be a loved one who's communicating in a way that their identity isn't, conveyed. Hard to know.
We have a question from Monica here, and she's wondering how she would go about getting credentialed.
Yeah. Also at the IADC website, there's information about training, and I know one person here in Texas. He lives real close to me. His name is Graham Maxey, and he's in Arlington, Texas, and he just did a training session a couple of weekends ago because one of my students attended it. And the training tends to be an intensive weekend, and he does it online, so you can be virtual. And yeah, so, and it, I'm trying to, I shouldn't say, when I went through it, it cost $800, but that was, several years ago. I don't know what he's charging now, but it's the kind of thing that, like, well, I will say, once you've gone through the training, I think it's really smart to meet with some of the other counselors and practice on each other before you let yourself loose on your clients. That's what I did when I first learned IADC. I brought 3 of my students with me, and then we met here in this is my home office behind me. And in fact, if we have time, I'll tell you a story about one of the episodes from that time when we were practicing on each other. That's very interesting.
So please hold on to that thought, and let's come back to it. The additional part of the question was, what are the requirements? But I'm assuming that she could get that information from going to NG.
Yes, but I can tell you that you need to be a licensed mental health professional, or at the least an intern at the intern level of preparation, where you're being supervised by a licensed person, and that's the Graham's criterion. And you don't have to believe in reincarnation or that sort of thing. You can believe that this is helpful fantasy if you want to. You believe what you want. It helps people. But yeah, but that's really the primary requirement, is to be either licensed or at least at the internship level.
Does it include EMDR? Do you have to have experience with EMDR to be able to do this training?
Different IADC trainers have different ideas about that. Al used to require people to go through EMDR first, which I did, but Graham doesn't require it. He doesn't think it's necessary. And I would say that IADC trainers are about split 50-50 about whether you really need to go through EMDR or not. I lean toward that you don't need to. You can learn what you need to through.
Do you think it would be open to chaplains and pastoral counselors?
Well, I'm not sure. That would be. I know licensed mental health professional. Like if somebody is a pastoral counselor and they're licensed, yes, but a chaplain, I tend to think not, because chaplains don't tend to do psychotherapy. I mean, this is still psychotherapy, and you really need to be licensed, because stuff can come up in this process that you need to know how to handle. Because people are opening up, they can get into traumas that are related to the loss of their loved one and all this kind of stuff. You really need to be somebody who does therapy with people. Yeah.
That makes perfect sense. If you'd like to go back then to that story that you tell us when you were training.
Okay. Let's see. I'll tell you one, and if we have time, I'll tell you another. But the one that came to mind then was, so one of my students, I'll call them Jay, was we were the 2 students who were observing were sitting in the couch here, and then Jay and I were sitting like right here, and Jay was facing this way and I was facing this way, and so we did a thing about Jay's sister, who had died like 10 years before, and Jay had never heard from the sister, ADC wise. And so we do the ADC thing, the IADC thing, and she has an experience of connection with her sister. And of course, there's a lot of tears in these sessions, because people are just so overjoyed to be in touch with their disembodied loved one. and so she has this profound sense of connection and all that stuff. And so she finishes, you know, it's like there's a kind of natural ending to the ADC itself. And then we're talking, we're processing and closing down the little session. And Jay says, I feel like a door has opened in my relationship with my sister, and that this is not the first time and not the only time I'm going to be in touch with her. I think we're connected now. And just as I was reflecting, so you have this sense of that your connection with her is going to go on and continue. Just then, this door pops open. That's on a friction. It's just a friction lock. You see how much pressure? I don't know if you can see how much. Anyway, it opens like this. Now, notice how it opens right now. It gets kind of faster when it goes, but this time it popped open and it just very slowly opened like this. So that my two students and I are just gape-jawed. And Jay is looking at me and saying, what? And I point back here just in time for them to turn around and see the door open. So a door was truly opening in their relationship. I've lived in this house for 27 years now. Never before or since has that door spontaneously opened. There was nobody else around. It just popped open. A door was opening in the relationship, and Jay's sister was here to let us know.
That was lovely. Yes.
Yeah. And then the other one was when I was getting practiced on, and we've been doing this for a couple, 3 weeks now, and so I'd been the client a couple times, and I was getting kind of low on my list of dead people I wanted to contact. So I thought of my cousin David, who I just adored, and he died shortly after coming back from the Vietnam War. I've often wondered if he committed suicide because he died in a car crash with his car on the railroad tracks, and a train came. And it's kind of like, really, how hard is it to get your car off the tracks? Not that that doesn't ever happen, but we know how badly veterans were treated and all that. And he was such a tender-hearted person. I think he must have been terribly traumatized by the war. Anyway, so I want to get in touch with David. So we do the preparatory stuff. We get through phase 1, phase 2, and now it's time to, do this and the worst part of the grief. And in my case, my counselor did this. I closed my eyes, and there was David, and he was just in the prime of life and healthy and whole. You can imagine what must have happened to his body, with the impact of the train. And he looked at me. There were no words, there was no other content. He just looked at me, and I looked at him. And in that look was absolute, unconditional, undying love. It was just what I call the look of love. And we just looked at each other and basked in the reconnection and the sense of, all that. And that went on for maybe 30, 40 seconds. And then his father, my Uncle Ray, who had just died a couple of years before. Now, David had died 15, 20 years before, but his father, Ray, had just died. He literally elbowed his way in front of David, and he held out his hand, and in his hand was an hourglass, and clear glass, wide at the top, narrow, wide, meant to sit on a table. I knew that, and again, without him saying anything explicit, I just knew that he wanted me to contact my still living Aunt Norma, his wife, and tell her that I had seen him and that this was a message for her. So I didn't understand, like, how could this be a message for her? So I try to like zoom in, and when I do, it disappears. And when I zoom out, it reappears. And then I think, well, I'm going to try looking at it from over here. And when I move, it disappears. And when I come back, it reappears. It's like, this is the message. Call her and tell her, this is it. It's all you're going to get. So I open my eyes. I say to my counselor, I tell her what's happening. And she says, and I say, oh, I hardly know Norma. I hardly knew Ray. I remember being in their house once, and we were down in the basement for a big family party. And their basement was like this unfinished thing. And, I just don't remember anything much about them. And I wasn't close to either of them for different reasons. They were perfectly really nice people, good-hearted people, but just didn't connect with them. So, I'm going to call my Aunt Norma that I haven't talked to in, decades and say, I just am calling to let you know I saw Ray in a vision. And he told me, no way. Well, so I said to Jenny, I know, I'll call him. I'll write her a letter. And that way I'll start by saying, if anything that you're about to read bothers you, just stop reading, throw this away, and, don't mind it at all. So my counselor, whose name was Jenny, said, well, okay, why don't you see what Ray thinks about that? So she does this. I close my eyes, and now Ray, he's still got the hourglass in this hand, but then he's got a telephone receiver in the other hand. Like, call her. So I opened my eyes, and pardon my French, I said, shit, he wants me to call her, Well, long story short, I did eventually screw up the courage to call her. And when I told her the story, and, and first, of course, did she want to hear about this? And oh, yeah, she did. So then fine, I tell her the story. I get to the end and I say, I have no idea what that hourglass thing meant. And she said, oh, I know exactly what it meant. And I'm like, you do? She says, yeah. When I was growing up, we used to go visit my grandmother. It was real boring. And she had these 2 cut crystal vases that she kept on an end table that had a glass shelf. So I'd lie down on my back, scoot up under the table, and watch the sun glint through these 2 vases. And it was so beautiful. And I could amuse myself, for 15 or 20 minutes with that. So when she died, all I wanted from her estate was those 2 things. She said, I'm looking at them right now. They're on my dining room table. And she said, the thing is, they're different shapes, but they're both wide at the top, narrow at the in the middle, wide at the bottom, meant to sit on a table. Oh, and I don't know if I mentioned, the hourglass didn't have any sand in it. And I'm like, what is an hourglass without sand? And she said, of course, the vases don't have sand in them. They're clear glass, And she said, what Ray knew is if we woke up in the middle of the night and there was a fire and we had to run out, I would stop and pick those up on my way out because they're just the most precious material thing I own. And she said, nothing you could have told me would convince me more that he's waiting for me. So that was really wonderful. And what I would call a veridical ADC, because I got information that meant nothing to me, that I didn't know what it meant, and yet was perfectly meaningful to the person for whom the message was intended.
We have just a couple of more minutes left. What do you think the future is of ADC research? Oh, and I have a raised hand.
I think just more research on IADC, that I really believe that this IADC has the potential to revolutionize grief counseling and be of tremendous help to thousands of people who otherwise would not have had, that experience and that relief from their grief. So that would be my answer.
Do you think we'll get any better at capturing some of the communication? Hasn't there been some work done in Brazil? Dr. Sandra, I forget her last name, with this telephone.
Yes, and also Gary Schwartz has done soul phone
Yes.
research. Yeah, about getting communication from the beyond. I don't know. I mean, certainly it could be applied to after-death communication, but a lot of times they're looking for communication from anybody who wants to come through for any reason. Yeah.
Have a question or a comment from Eva. Go ahead, Eva. We will unmute you.
Okay, thank you. That was an excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it. But I want to tell you my experience with after-death communication.
Yeah.
My mother passed away during COVID, the first year. And in Greece, she was in a nursing home with dementia for a year and a half. And of course, I could not go when she passed. However, 3 weeks later, she shows up in my dream. She loved flowers, so she was in an amazing flower garden with a brilliant smile. Did not say anything, but I knew, and she looked very young. That was the first one. Then she appeared again when I had COVID. And I had COVID. It was pretty bad, and then I had long COVID. So this was again in a dream. I was laying in the bed, and she came and laid next to me with a pink nightgown that I had given her years before. And she held my hand, and that was so strange because I felt her human side and her spiritual side, which I cannot explain in words, you know, how I felt this difference, but I did. And she stayed there for a while, and then she got up and left. And I took it as reassurance that you'll be okay, don't worry. Mm-hmm. And then the third time, it started as a dream. I saw her in the nursing home sitting in a chair, and the last months of her life, she could not keep her head up. So her head had a tendency of falling back. And I saw her head falling back, and she started screaming while the nursing staff surrounded her. I wake up from that scream, and I sit on the side of my bed, and there is my mother in the pink same gown, praying in front of several icons that I have in the corner of my bedroom. And my eyes just could not believe what this was. I was in such shock because I never had that experience. But another thing about her was before she passed, when she was fine, she always said she had this idea that once you die, you can no longer pray for your kids. And she found that very difficult. And now she's showing up to me the way she always stood in front of icons praying. Of course, my husband is an agnostic and doesn't believe that stuff. And one of my daughters also, you know, and my very religious brother, you know, they didn't believe it, but I know it in my heart, and that's what counts.
Absolutely. And another thing that was really beautiful about that last one is that she showed you first the physical distress she was in, but then showed you she's done with that. She's good and able to do the things she was afraid she wouldn't be able to do, that had to do with caring for you all. So yeah, how wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Jan. We've actually reached 4 o'clock hours, so appreciate it. An absolutely fascinating presentation. Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing.
Oh, my pleasure.
References so I can pass them on.
I will.
How extraordinary, and I'm sure you have many, many more stories as well.
I do. Yeah. And some of the people who are here may have more stories too, and may want to request another session just among you all while you share your stories.
Indeed.
Yeah. Well, thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
An absolute pleasure. Thank you, everybody. See you next time. Bye-bye now. Take care.
Bye.